Hello and welcome to another exclusive interview with ET Edge Insights. Today we have with us Mr. Sanjay Vyas. He is the Executive VP and Managing Director of Parexel India. Sanjay, thank you for taking the time out and speaking to ET Edge Insights. It's a pleasure to host you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure. It's equally mine as well. And good to talk to you again.
Thank you. Let me begin by asking you, what are the specific challenges researchers in India face with regards to clinical research?
So there are a couple of factors when it comes to clinical research in India, right? So one is if you really look from an infrastructure perspective today, definitely the infrastructure development that's happening in tier 2, tier 3 cities are still not at par at what you look at from a tier 1 city perspective. The access to the investigator sites or the hospitals, again, is much more different. The other piece is the technology implementation as well. Like if you really look from an overall landscape perspective, even though India is the second largest mobile device users, but if you really look, 67% of them is actually in tier 1 cities. Right. If you go to the rural areas, there's only 34% of the population using the technology piece of it. So the access to the technology, the digitization piece of it is still a challenge that remains. The other most important part also is the complexities of the new therapies or the studies that are coming into the market, right? As you see with cell and gene therapy, with genomics, the studies are becoming more and more complicated.
Right.
So that's becoming more and more tedious to conduct clinical studies. It's just not India, but generally to conduct studies across as well. And last but not the least, I think the education that's needed to recruit patients into the clinical trial, because even today, clinical trials is still looked upon as an alternative therapy and not as a primary therapy for and that becomes a hindrance when it comes to recruiting patients, educating them about the advantages and making that as an alternative therapy or a main therapy to get the drugs faster into the market.
Right. Now, when we talk about emerging technologies, how can emerging technologies, create that advantage in clinical research?
I think there are a couple of areas. It's great to see that we are living in an era when there is such a rapid change that's taking place from a technology perspective, right? Interestingly, if you all remember the phase when Netflix or the dot-coms and the other stuff that came in, it took the social media, right, at that point of time, it took like to reach 1 to 2 million user base, it took kind of 1 to 2 years of time frame. When ChatGPT came in last year, within 1 month, the 1 million user base reached, right? So when you're living in an era when technology is such rapidly changing, it definitely has a huge advantage from an implication and a challenge perspective as well. So one is definitely with technologies like artificial intelligence or the usage of natural language processing, or we call it as the NLP, there's a huge advantage to start looking at redundant, repetitive tasks that are happening from a clinical study kind of perspective to automate them so that the subject matter experts or the physicians or the technical experts can focus on the core part of the study conduct, and which becomes so much more easier. The other area is content generation, because there's so much of data that is curated as a part of the study conduct. There's so much of content that gets generated.
Right.
I think with the advent of the artificial intelligence, generating that content in a much more efficient manner and making it more efficient for the studies to be conducted, and actually that's going to be another positive implication that would come from a technology perspective. The adjacent parts like telemedicine, the telehealth, it is actually enabling us today to start looking at taking the study to patients' home rather than the patients coming to the investigator site or the hospitals. So if there's a regular blood draw that needs to happen with a particular patient, you don't need to have the patient come to the hospital. You can send a device, you just prick it, you get the blood draw, you send it back. The physician is monitoring over the telehealth, and then the data gets collected through remote monitoring. So there are these advantages of technology that can really boost the whole conduct of study conduct that's happening in India at this point in time.
Right. While we see the benefits of technology, there's one critical challenge, especially when adoption of these technologies. There are certain ethical considerations and regulations with regards to our Indian healthcare system. So what are these specific ethical considerations and regulations?
Yeah, so I'll try to address this in two parts. So let's talk about the regulatory considerations, right? So one is, yes, every single drug development that happens in India, or rather has to go through a regulatory authority approval. So the moment you try to get a technology included as a part of the drug development process,
Right.
CDSCO approvals are required. Now, it's actually good because at the end of the day, there are certain guidelines that are being. Now, there are challenges in terms of defining. They're not very clear guidelines in terms of what's allowed and what's not, but to a very large extent, the guidelines in terms of how the devices will be used. Not only that, but once you use the device, the data that's getting extracted out of that device, how are you going to consolidate that data and put it in a manner and use it in a manner that's more in a regulated format, so that you do not compromise the patient information or the confidential information, because that's the critical component. I believe with the DPDP Act, the Digital Protection Act, that is being formed at this point of time, is actually coming as a blessing to the way the clinical trials are conducted, because you have to understand that the clinical study conduct by default is a very complex and compliant process, and anything that regulates that in a manner that allows you to maintain the patient confidentiality, patient data, and manage that data in a more effective manner and not just get that data dispersed out is what is going to be the regulatory considerations. Now, from an ethical perspective, I think it's what is more important is you have to make sure that when you're deploying technologies, you have to make the patient aware of how this technology is going to work. It's very similar to patient consent. If I'm a patient and getting recruited in a clinical trial, I give a consent to participate in a trial, to go through that drug. I know the adverse events, but the same thing has to happen now from a technology perspective. How is that technology going to reflect? How is that technology going to use my data? Where is that data going to sit? How is that technology then ultimately, wherever that data repository lies, how safe it is to make sure that data then doesn't get leaked out in a manner that continues to remain in a context. So those are the ethical considerations that come. And last but not the least, which is the most important one, is the patient safety. Is that technology good enough from a patient safety perspective, just like we look at the drug? So,
AI-powered in-house lab. There's a critical partnership, that a strategic partnership which you can talk about for your operations efficiency, and an networking operations center in Hyderabad. So how are these initiatives leveraging your organization towards a complete digital CRO?
Well, it's an interesting path, right? Everybody is now focusing on how do we become a fully digitized CRO as we move forward, because we have to move with the technology, with the example I gave earlier on. So let me address this part by part. So the AI Labs was a fantastic acquisition that we did a couple of years back. With the entire idea was, how could we look at some of those generative AI technologies that we can develop in-house, focusing on three major criteria. So the first major criteria was anything that requires search and retrieval, because there's so much of data that sits. There are thousands of SOPs, standard operating procedures, that we have to follow. Our clinical monitors, when they're on the site, if they have to find an information about a particular therapy or a particular study conduct that's going on, they have to go through manually through the process. Now with AI, they're able to just do immediately and ask the generative AI to pull out an information, a particular information on an oncology study going on at a particular site. So the search and retrieval process is becoming much more efficient. The second part, as I highlighted, is the content generation. So the whole clinical protocol writing process, I'm just giving you an example. The AI is now today has the ability to draft the first clinical protocol. Now, obviously, you require a medic to review the whole medical protocol to see the authenticity and the inclusion-exclusion criteria and everything that's required. But at least the first part of that rough draft of the protocol design, optimizing that protocol is done by AI. So that's the second area. And the third area is the automation of the redundant processes. So I would call it the workflow automation. So when you conduct clinical trials, there are certain areas where you're following a certain workflow automation. With the application of AI and using AI labs, we are able to now address some of those workflow automations. So contracts is a great example, right? We have to do site contracts, we have to do patient contracts, we have to do, there's so many multiple stakeholders. So all those workflow automation is now the development of generative AI and applicability with the use of AI labs. We are able to address that. The second piece, we also did a tie-up with a company called Partex. Partex is one of those organizations that's actually developed technology platforms to bring drugs faster into the market, especially applying to new drug formulation or new drug development into the early piece of it. So now what we are trying to do with Partex is trying to work together and see, hey, that technology platform, if combined with clinical study conduct, how can we get the drug faster into the market? The third integration that we did recently, which was again published, was a tie-up with Plantair. Now, Plantair is an organization that has developed a Foundry platform that's very heavily into data analytics and data insights. Now, because clinical study is all about data,
Absolutely.
I think using that Foundry platform, we are now trying to apply that towards getting a whole holistic view of how the data looks at or is being looked upon from a clinical study kind of perspective. So that will help us in future with protocol optimization. It will help us with study design optimization. It will help us even further looking at how patients are recruited, where are the reasons why patients are dropping out of the process, how are we going to then report that back to the regulators? So like literally looking at from an end-to-end perspective.
Right.
So that's the advantage that we're looking at. So these are some of the examples that we're now trying to apply. Of course, it's in bits and pieces, and then we're trying to get the whole story together.
Right.
But that's our part to digitization as a full-blown CRO.
Right, right. So interestingly, you've just talked about how emerging technology is boosting this sector and the entire Indian healthcare ecosystem for that matter. So, Sanjay, if I may ask you, in a span of say 5 years, how do you see emerging technology playing a part in clinical research?
I think it will be interesting. Of course, I don't have a magic wand right now to predict exactly, but what we can see from the trend at this point of time, one of the interesting things that are coming up is the usage of quantum computing in the applicability of the drug development process.
Right.
We are seeing that with the use of quantum computing, you're algorithmically able to create a digital human genome. And before the drug even gets into the clinical study conduct, you first try the drug on a digital human and then see. The biggest advantage of that is, you still will have to conduct a human trial. And the reason for that is a human genome is a human genome. The drug, with the way it reacts on me and the way it reacts on you, will be very different.
Absolutely.
Because your genome is different, I have a different genome.
Right.
So to test that out, you'll still require clinical study conduct. But what happens with this technology, you will be able to detect the safety and the adverse events of those drugs much more in advance, and you know what is the efficacy of the drug even before you test it on a human being.
Right.
So that's the kind of advent we are talking about moving. The other important thing, which is an interesting thing that's happening, is the concept of digital twin. So we're talking about at some point of time, you and me will start having our digital twins that will interact with our physicians on a regular basis, and that will allow us to predict the potential adverse events that might happen for a particular drug as we are going forward. So that's going to further help with the study conduct. And last but not the least, as all of this, the big data starts getting together, the electronic health record starts getting cleaned up, they get set up with all the hospitals, the use of real world data, the real world evidence, the digital twin data that will come in, and the clinical data will help us get drugs much more faster and efficiently into the market. But that's what the vision I see in the next 5 years.
Right, right. Sanjay, on that note, fantastic conversation, and I wish you all the best for all the innovation and work you're doing. It was a pleasure having this conversation.
Thank you. The pleasure is equally mine. Appreciate it.